Hi, everyone. So, I just wanted to give my thoughts regarding signs. Now, some of you might not know what signs are. They are the practice of putting a plus or a minus next to an information element, say SE plus or SE minus. Now, what provoked my thinking around this subject, at least enough thinking to create a video response, was watching a very recent video by Rusted Typology, where Rusty has essentially come out saying that he no longer identifies as an SLE. He has realized that he was actually an SEE all along. Now, I think that takes, first of all, a lot of guts, a lot of courage to go out and say that. To say that you were mistaken and to change your mind. It's a very good practice, a very noble practice. I think many more people should do it if they happen to find out that they are not the type which they thought they were. I think it would be good for the typology community if this became very common practice for people as they learn, develop, and grow in their understanding of typology. And he also provides some good arguments for why he was SCE rather than SLE, especially regarding his approach to introverted ethics and introverted logic. And indeed, I've observed in his channel that there's been a tendency for him to sort of spam multiple, actually quite contradicting typologies, not really showing the same discernment as I might show in saying how the typologies actually contradict each other, how essentially if you're presenting this typology or another typology, maybe they actually overlap in places, and maybe it's better to actually combine them together or to discard the parts which aren't actually working in the overall mix. So I haven't really seen, just by looking through some of his videos, that usage of introverted logic, and it seems to me that he has identified something similar himself. These were good arguments, but from that point, he starts saying how I'm drawing the distinction between how he may have been an SLE in Western socionics, but he's actually an SEE in classical socionics, thereby drawing a distinction between the two. And it's a distinction which other people, Curtis has tried to draw said distinction as well. I found it to be a difficult distinction. I mean, one is a geographical term. It is socionics developed in the West, predominantly English speakers, whereas classical suggests something which is older as opposed to newer, something which is based in a certain accepted canon of socionics. And I think there are, first of all, multiple Western approaches, different schools. I think some Western approaches are classical, actually, and some are not so classical. In the same way, as opposed to Western, there's also a more Eastern approach to socionics. Schools in socionics found in Kiev, in Moscow, in Vilnius, and other places, which again may be classical or not classical. So I don't see this as actually a good dichotomy to perhaps draw. Not that I think Rusted was deliberately drawing that dichotomy per se, but it seemed that way from the way the conversation was going on that video. And I would instead say that, yeah, you could be Western and you can be classical. You could be Eastern and not classical. And you can be vice versa. I would say that what makes something classical does depend on the person's point of view. Curtis, for instance, one of his criticisms of me was that I was not classical in his view because I deviated in some way from Auschra. The problem, of course, is that Auschra deviates from Auschra. And if you were to look through Auschra's work, you will see that a lot of her writing is very seminal, it's very experimental, and she changes her point of view as she is writing from one work to another. This is not a bad thing. This is very much to be expected by any creator of any sort of personality theory. Jung's ideas changed, Plato's ideas changed. So, yeah, to define classical in terms of being true entirely to the source material of someone writing is flawed because said person in their writing will not be true to the rest of what they are writing, because people do change and develop. That is complexity. So instead, I think it's being true to a certain canon. The canon can't be a single person's writings unless they have at some point said this is the definitive edition and my views will not change after this point. And if they do, that is moving away from said definitive edition. No such thing has been put forward by Austra Augustinaviciutia, and no such thing as tend to be put forward by any other wise writer, knowing that they can always change their mind in the future, as people tend to do. So really, I'd say that trueness to a certain canon would be a better definition of classical, and that commonly accepted canon is Model A or Model Augustina Viciutia, and that model is the 8 information metabolism elements placed into the 8 functions, those functions making up the ego, the superego, the superid, and the id, which is very much in line with Ausch's works, as one would expect. But yes, is the consolidated set of ideas that come out from Ausch's work and her ongoing thinking over a number of years. So that has become very much the accepted canon. I would say that a classical approach is that which sticks to that accepted canon, Model A. I would give an example of a non-classical approach being something which very much abandons said canon. Let's say Galenko's Model G, which is a departure from Model A. To be changing the name, changing the entire structure, what the different things mean, where they are placed, how they relate to one another. It is a substantial departure, it's a complete departure. So that would be example of a non-classical approach to socionics. Whereas I'd say that any approach to socionics that sticks with Model A can, I would say, build upon Model A, can, with good reason, explain a certain dichotomy in a slightly different interpretation, where room for interpretation may be given. I would say that is still classical. Now, for people to nevertheless get an idea of what some of the works of Austra Augustinowicz Schultier say, I would, as Rusted also did, I would point them to classicsocionics.wordpress.com, written very diligently by Sophia, also known as Axiom. She presents a large number of Austra's original writings, translated into English for people to understand and make sense of. Now, what they will very quickly find if they go through is that there is a certain absence, and said absence is signs. Now, here is the issue when talking about Rusty's self-analysis. Not only did he talk about introverted ethics and introverted logic and arguments for their strength or dimensionality, which is very much in keeping with Model A, but he went further to say that he was a user of SE plus as opposed to SE minus, and describing SE plus as a more expansionistic, conquering approach to extroverted sensation, whereas SE minus was a more sort of defensive, really about defending against threats sort of approach to extroverted sensation, or avenging wrongs, or that sort of thing. The distinction between SE plus and SE minus is therefore treated as a very important thing for understanding the different types. However, if you were to look on classicsocionics.wordpress.com, you would find no mention of SE plus or SE minus. So that being presented by Rusted as an example of classical approaches to socionics, a means by which he can return back to a source to find the truth for his own typing, is not actually grounded in fact. It is not the case that signs are classical. They are not Western, they are pretty much Eastern. You can see them developing from the thoughts of Galenko, from the thoughts of Bukalov as well, but that doesn't mean that they are classical. There's no point where an examination of Model A would lead one to consider signs. There's no point where the necessity for signs is reached from going through how the 8 information metabolism elements are defined and how they fit into each of the 8 functions, each of which are similarly thoroughly defined to form the 16 types. So, yeah, it's not classical. And that's one reason why I don't use signs. There's no good reason for them within Model A. And I would go so far as to say that people who do use them almost always end up confused. Now, I don't think necessarily everyone who uses signs ends up confused. I think partly because there are different definitions of a signs floating around, and some happen to line up perfectly well with how things would be even if the signs weren't there, in which case they're just superfluous, not instead of confusing. Um, an example might be, for instance, talk to my friend Kimani, who actually uses the signs, but after further investigation, he found that his use of the signs was purely to differentiate between SE when it's put with TI, as opposed to SE when it's put with FI. So really, it's a semantic problem rather than a theoretical difference of opinion. But yes, when it comes to people using signs in terms of there being 2 kinds of SE, and SE plus or SE minus, there is no logical basis for creating 2 of every single information metabolism element, creating essentially 16 different elements instead of 8. Not only is there no basis in the classical approach to socionics, I would also say that it is simply not correct. There's no logical um, grounding for it, let alone whether it's in classical literature or not. For you to have 16 information metabolism elements, that means you would have to have 15 information dichotomies by which you can further define and explain in full the differences between all 16 of said information metabolism elements with their signs. And that would be quite a headache. There are already 7 to explain the 8 information metabolism elements. So, yeah, the rule is the number of dichotomies is always equal to the number of entities being defined minus 1. So 7 dichotomies for 8 information metabolism elements, and it would mean 15 would be needed for 16 information metabolism elements. And yes, the question of then seeing how they vary and change depending on which of the 8 functions they're placed into, and exactly why some functions are left, why some information metabolisms, almost half of them, are left out of the 8 function model. It just opens up a can of worms of questions, which will basically open up further and further and further into confusion and doubt and all the rest. It really unravels the theory. The more you think about it, the more it leads to a sequence of further questions, which means that you no longer have a theory that works and no longer have a theory that actually fits together and makes sense. So there are all sorts of problems by actually operating on the assumption that actually 16 information metabolism elements rather than 8. So rather than subdivide the 8 into 16, which leads to theoretical disaster, instead, where I've seen more sensible approaches to signs, I would treat Kid Kamani as an example of this. You ever heard of Kamani? He's I think, a very, very sophisticated thinker in the socionic space, a good typologist as well, in terms of working out the types of famous figures. Is really, rather than subdividing the information metabolism elements, it's in fact talking about the different combinations of elements, talking about how elements can combine to lead to emergent properties or effects. So if you were to say, for instance, that SE minus is really nothing more than SE with when it's blocked with TI, you could say that's an emerging property. Although that also leads to the problem, which is SE plus TI is seen as with a minus because it's SE minus. But surely, if it's SE and TI, that means that SE minus must be the same or synonymous with TI plus, which would be TI plus SE. And how do they really differ? Well, elementally, they don't differ. they differ functionally, because one is Ti in the leading function, the other one is Se in the leading function, which leads to the differences in the sign. So really, even that doesn't really work in terms of it being an emergent property of two elements being blocked together. Now, I've given this rather a bit of thought, and I think it's got rather more to do with the leading and the mobilizing function, and how, rather than being blocked together, they work together as a sort of emergent theme in each type. And this takes me to what determines, at least according to Galenko or Bukolov, what determines whether something is given a positive sign or a negative sign. So, yes, when it comes to Bukolov and Galenko originally as well, they set out the idea that the process types are the ones that which, also known as right spinning, they somehow move information forwards in a sort of natural, organic way. They're meant to be ones who sort of drive social progress in some way. It goes to the process result Reining dichotomy, the most advanced, most sort of far off, most far removed from the foundations of the theory, Reining dichotomy. Mathematically exists. It's an important dichotomy. It's just always been a very big challenge to actually define well. But the idea is that for Bukolov and initially Galenko, but he then changed his mind, all types which are process had a plus for their leading function, and all types which were a result had a minus next to their leading function, which would cause different effects. Of course, this then it's then also led to people then having to sort of define, say, what Fe minus was as opposed to Fe plus, Ne plus as opposed to Ne minus. There's an interesting paper on this. You can find that on the 16 types.info. It talks about Fe plus from this perspective as being to do with positive. Fe minus has to do with Fe minus is described as negative emotions, grief, sorrow, sadness, emotional recession, depression, crying, all the sort of negative emotions, and positive emotions are titled Fe plus, so joy, merriment, emotional elation, excitement, etc., etc. And these descriptions lead to problems because they don't actually describe the types they're meant to describe. It's commonly accepted that ESE is to do with positive emotionality, and the EIE is to do more with the negative emotions on average, but that's not really accurate. It's more about authentic self-expression without the sort of veneer or superficiality of positivity, even during hard times. But so that leads to a sort of difficulty where what's given doesn't actually match what the types are. And these are descriptions which Galenko has written, and it may explain why Galenko then changed his mind on process and result being the thing which determines whether someone has a plus sign or a minus sign. He changed his mind to positivist negativist, and positive negativist is another Reining dichotomy. It's about as advanced or removed from the foundations as process result. But it kind of makes sense that given it's called positivist negativist, it will be lined up with the positive or negative signs attributed to leading functions. And this is where I think we could start to see something which makes sense for the types, as a sort of emergent property, not as a subdivision. So rather than there being Se plus, which is supposedly indistinguishable from Se plus Fi, which doesn't work because Fi is going to be negative next to the Se plus. Instead of having that sort of problem where the mirrors sort of clearly use their information elements the same sort of way, and the only difference is functional, and getting to that whole trouble. Instead, you'll find that positivist and negativist enables us to look at the leading and the mobilizing instead. Why is that? Because now within the quadra, activating types, these are types which share an activator relationship. They share the same status as positivist and negativist. Under Glenker's original position and Bukalov's position, they don't. Because what? Because if you take, say, in the alpha quadrant, the ILE and the ESC, the ILE and the ESC, they are both positivist types, but one is a process type, the other one is a result type. So the shift to positivist and negativist causes ILE and ESC to suddenly share in their positivity and their negativity. And when looking at what information elements these types have in similar sorts of functions, well, they have the same, what I call assertive functions, a leading function, and mobilizing function. The idea here is that they are positivists because it's not to do with NE plus TI or NE as opposed to, say, NE plus FI or TI plus NE. Instead, it's NE operating alongside FE, and ESC does that, and so does ILE, because for one, NE is the leading function and FE is the mobilizing function. For the other, FE is the leading function and NE is the mobilizing function. And we'll see this carried across for all the other quadrants. The alpha energizers are positivists, the alpha integrators are negativists. The beta integrators are positivists, the beta energizers are negativists, and etc., etc. This enables us to see certain themes and characterize them in terms of having a positivist or negativist effect, while still not running into the trouble of mirrors being different. Because yes, mirrors are different because they don't have the same functions in their leading and mobilizing. They have the other ones. So SEI and LII in alpha, they don't have FE and NE in their leading and mobilizing functions, the functions which do all the sort of pushing. Instead, they have SI and TI, which I would say actually creates a more negativistic effect. So this is how I prefer to understand signs. Really, I'd say you should just get rid of signs. It leads to confusion. It leads to this idea we need to subdivide the 8 into 16, when really all it needs to be is positivist, negativist as a Reining dichotomy, and that is an emergent property out of information elements and how they interact, specifically how the leading and mobilizing interact with each other to lead to an overall positivistic or negativistic effect. And I can explain what that's like. Actually, I have already explained what that's like. If you go to my Explain Correctly series and you look up NE plus FE explained correctly, or NE plus TE explained correctly, and all the others where it's not the naturally blocked pair, but it's the thematic ones where they share the same vertness, two extroverted functions, or two extroverted elements, two introverted elements, then yeah, you got me describing a theme, and that's going to have a positivistic spin or a negativistic spin on it. And I think that's where this gets really, really useful, because this allows us to draw out the distinctions, especially where types are likely to clash with other types, where they are being positivist or negativist in the same domains. I say domains such as sensation, logic, ethics, and intuition. So you take ILE and ESE, and they're both positivist. They're going to clash with ILI and ESI, both negativists in gamma, over intuition and ethics. One takes the positivistic NE and FE together, the other takes the more negativistic FI and NI together. And what you'll see, as I've described in NEFE and NIFI, is you'll see the desire to say yes to all possibilities, to enthusiastically spread ideas, to include everything and anything, pitted against the desire to say no to possibilities, the desire to actually control for negative outcomes, the desire to distrust and really be selective and discerning over what is of good intent and what is of bad intent, and to keep the bad out of one's life by focusing on the few people that matter. and being perfectly willing to cut people off who are not who are not exceptionally good for you. A sort of default yes to the world as opposed to a default no to the world, and how that leads to clear clashes between people. This is how positivism and negativism can be made meaningful and relevant without opening up a whole logical can of worms that unravels the theory entirely, or leads to people completely having to retype people from SLE to SEE. And going back to what Russell was saying, as a result of SE being SE positive being the sort of conquering one, SE negative being the defending one, and therefore suddenly the SLE is not the true conqueror, the SEE is. I would say no. SE, when it is a leading function, is going to be acting as a leading function. And that means that SE is going to be expansive, because SE as an extroverted function is expansive, and it is going to be pushed onto one's surroundings because that's what the leading function does. And as its SE is going to be about impacting on in the real present world. So both SCE and SLE can take a conquering approach. The difference is that for one, there's going to be a negativistic motivation, and that's because of SE with FE. And it's the idea of you can't just be yourself implicitly. You can't just be a person just by existing. No, you have to make your existence matter to others. You have to create a name for yourself. SE plus FE is negativistic approach to sensation and ethics together, which is the authenticity of something. Is it real? Does it really exist? Do I really exist? Do I really exist if no one is looking at me or even remembers me after I'm gone? This is what the EIE and SLE are bothered by. And this is why they need to create a name for themselves. They need to matter in some way. Meanwhile, and sorry, and that leads them to really be the SLE to really be a conqueror for the glory, for the sense of making a name for themselves, for there to be a statue of them thousands of years later after they're long gone, to have made that impact on the world that people recognize. That is very much a mark of a conqueror. Whereas for the SEE, it's positivistic in terms of sensation and logic. And this becomes much more to do with a sort of restless personal advancement. That doesn't necessarily mean conquering others, because you don't necessarily need other people to recognize what you're doing. You just need to be someone who has maximized your success and your achievement, and you're continuously working to achieve ever more. And I guess you could, and you are still conquering in a way, but you're conquering really for yourself, for your own self advancement. It's not about necessarily going out and conquering countries and making your mark on the world. It's really about being as successful as you can be and being the master of your own destiny. And that's a positivism, because the idea is achievement, to actually go out and achieve, to sensation and logic together. The positivism of that is really maximizing one's effect on the world, one's effect in terms of not how people are reacting to you, but rather what is actually working. The positivistic approach is to say, right, I've achieved this. What else can I achieve? How else can I be more effective? How else can I be more successful? So that's a positivistic spin, unlike SE and FE, where it takes a negativistic spin, because the idea is it's really your authenticity is almost not being simply yourself. It's by becoming an image that is almost removed from yourself, which also ties into Glenker's idea of actually negativism being somehow removed from the person who's engaging in it. So, yeah, that I would say is why SLEs and SEs can both be conquerors, but the SLE is more naturally attracted to the role of being a conqueror of men, of being a figure like an Alexander the Great or a Napoleon. whereas an SEE is usually more attracted to the idea of being an independently successful person who doesn't allow other people to get in the way of their personal success. And you can take that to be a Mark Cuban, for instance. You could take it to Julius Caesar, who was a conqueror, definitely a conqueror of Gaul in the way you expect of an SLE to be, except for him, it wasn't about having a statue of him for years on years. For him, it was really about rising within a society where he could easily end up being subordinate to someone else unless he were to rise up to the top. And that was for him the point, to rise up to the top so that he would never be under anyone else. It was for him, it was about his independent success, not about there being a statue of him many, many years from now. So, yes, that's how I try to make sense of this complex area. And really, again, say that signs are neither classical nor are they correct. I would recommend that you don't use them. Instead, think about some of these more advanced Reining dichotomies, how they emerge from Model A. Be very careful how they're defined, because much of the time they're not defined well, often defined very inaccurately. But think critically about that. But also, to make sure you get them right, consider purchasing my course so that you are taken through the Reining dichotomies in detail and you're able to understand exactly why they can be defined in a way that does make sense, that does fit into the theory coherently, and enable you to understand the system as a whole in all of its elegance and its majesty. Anyway, thank you for tuning in. Have a lovely rest of your evening and take care. Bye bye.